Hello everybody and welcome back for another Dundee local history story. And this week we are going to delve into some true crime from Victorian Dundee. And our story starts off when two thieves by the name of David Jenkins and John Milton ended up sharing a cell in Dundee Jail. And at this time, the jail and the courthouse shared a premises on Bell Street in the city centre. And John Milton, he'd been arrested for stealing 2 pairs of trousers from a shop on the High Street and 1 pair of trousers from a shop on the Overgate. So this is a fairly minor offence. But he did have quite a long record of other sort of minor thefts and small jail sentences, and the court took a pretty heavy hand with him. They gave him 8 years for this. And the other thief in our story, David Jenkins, he was maybe a wee bit more of a serious criminal. He'd been arrested for theft by garrotting, and so he and some accomplices had mugged a labourer who was visiting Dundee for one New Year. They'd sort of sneaked up behind him, grabbed him by the neck and gone through his pockets. This was also not the first time Jenkins had found himself up in court either. He had 13 charges of assault and robbery on his record, and he got sentenced to 10 years imprisonment for this. And he was not a happy bunny hearing the sentence. He allegedly shouted at the judge, "I hope you will sit there till I come back, that's what I hope." So the two were placed in a cell together. And thus began the story of what was going to become Dundee's most notorious jailbreak attempt. And they seem to be quite different characters. Milton, who was the unfortunate trouser thief, he wasn't such an angry character as Milton. He seemed to be a bit more desperate and depressed, and he really didn't cope well with being in jail. And the jailers actually put Milton's hands in handcuffs to stop him from hurting himself, which it did physically work, but it must have made him a lot more miserable as well during his sentence. But Jenkins, as you kind of get the impression of from his outburst in court, he was a bit more of a fiery character, and he never had any intention of serving the full 10 years of his sentence. So he started scoping out the cell as soon as he was in there, looking for any points of weakness. And he noted 2 things. The first thing was that because they were on the ground floor, if they could prise up the flagstones, there would be earth underneath and they could probably dig a tunnel. And the other thing was he thought if he could get a hold of the right tools, he might be able to slip the door off its hinges. So those were the 2 possible plans. And it also helped that Jenkins was quite a popular man among the Dundee criminal networks. One of his friends who was in jail for a few days managed to throw him a pocket knife in passing. But him and Milton did start plotting together, and on one occasion Milton managed to distract the guards with sort of constant questions while Jenkins sneaked a poker that was lying next to the stove down his trouser leg on the way back from one of his sanctioned walks. So they decided the poker would be a good tool for trying to lever up the flagstones. And they tried it that night with Jenkins doing most of the physical work because Milton's hands, of course, were still cuffed. And they were absolutely astonished to discover that below their cell there ran an air flue, a sort of small tunnel running below the floors, which was a way of ventilating the prison. So they squeezed through this tiny passageway and crept a little bit along, and the flue got wider as they went under the main corridor. And they raised up another stone with the poker, which they still had with them. and they sort of came out and realised that they were in the corridor and they now had free run of the building. And because Milton didn't have the use of his hands, he found himself a position at the stairway, and he kept watch for anyone who might have been alerted to them moving about. And Jenkins went around looking for a way out of the building itself. And while Jenkins was creeping around the upper floor of the building, he saw there was a window just beside the courthouse library. And he thought he could break that window, and looking at the side of the building, the design had alternating stones jutting out at the corners of the building. It was almost like it had been designed as a ladder for jailbreakers. And he looked at this and he thought, I could break that window and I could be down the side of the building and over the fence in minutes. But he thought about Milton, and he knew his pal was never going to make it down with his hands cuffed. And he couldn't abandon his friend to take the blame, and they didn't have long left of the night. So Milton and Jenkins, they returned to their cell, and they covered their tracks, put all the flagstones back where they'd been, and they started to plot further. They knew that, of course, the main sort of flue ventilation system in the jail, that would have to come out into the open air somewhere if they could just sort of get into it enough. So they decided that they would try and dig a connection outside from the one that they had access to from their cell. And they spent every night after that, they would prise up the flagstone and dig away through the tunnels under the corridor. And they would carefully replace the stone every morning. And one night, the prison chaplain decided to pay them a visit. And of course, this took them very much by surprise. And Milton decided to use his reputation to his benefit there, and he slumped against the door, pretending he was in this great fit of melancholy and could not be roused. And he only sort of begrudgingly started to move once the stone had been replaced and all the earth had been safely hidden away beneath it. And he kept up a sort of sullen and depressed manner, which meant that the chaplain soon gave up and left them to it again. And after a week or so of digging away a little bit on their tunnel each night, Milton and Jenkins thought that they were just about below the ground on the outside of the prison, and there seemed to be only earth above them now rather than stone. And they decided it was time to give their great escape another try. So just before 1 o'clock on a Sunday morning, they lifted the flagstone and they squeezed into the flue beneath their cell, and they crawled along and along the corridor. And when they got to the end point, they started digging upwards and upwards, and they were so relieved when they felt the fresh air coming in above their heads. And they found themselves standing outside in the prison grounds. So they were halfway to freedom, but of course there was still a wall between them and the outside world. And poor Milton still had his handcuffs on, so that was going to be a challenge. And if you want to find out whether they make it over the wall and what becomes of our two thieves, then you're going to have to come back next week and hear the second half of the story. So we will see you next week, and goodbye for now.